You wake up in a world where your teeth rot before you hit 30, where the air smells like damp wool and unwashed bodies, and where the floorboards creak underfoot, not because they're old, but because they're soaked with years of spilled stew, animal dung, and who knows what else. You blink into the dim morning light, filtering through a tiny window, if it can even be called that, just a hole covered by a scrap of oiled cloth. Your mouth feels like it's lined with moss. Your throat scratchy from last night's sour ale, and your joints ache like you've been dragged behind a horse all night. Welcome to life in the Middle Ages. Congratulations. You probably won't survive past 40. The room around you is cramped, barely big enough for a straw-stuffed mattress, a wooden chest, and a table that looks like it's been gnawed on by generations of hungry children. There's no mirror. Not that you'd want one. Most people here don't know what their own faces look like beyond the occasional glimpse in a still puddle or a polished bit of tin. And trust me, you wouldn't want to see yourself right now anyway. You haven't bathed in weeks, maybe months. Clean water isn't exactly flowing out of every tap because there are no taps. Just a well if you're lucky, or a nearby stream if you're feeling adventurous and willing to risk catching something unspeakable from the local livestock. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, stretch your back, try not to step on any stray rats scurrying across the floor, and glance outside. The village is waking up, but it's not the peaceful dawn you might imagine. Roosters crow like alarm clocks set to maximum volume. Pigs squeal in protest as someone prods them with a stick, and somewhere down the road, a blacksmith is already hammering away at his anvil like he hasn't slept in days. Which, knowing medieval work schedules, he probably hasn't. If you're watching this from somewhere cozy, maybe curled up under a blanket with a cup of tea, you might be thinking, well, at least I'm not that guy. But let's be honest, if you woke up here tomorrow, you'd last about 3 days before contracting some weird infection from touching a door handle. Speaking of which, go ahead and wave hello to your new best friend's parasite's disease and the ever-present threat of being accused of witchcraft for sneezing too loudly. Post your location and local time below, so we can all marvel at how much better off you are compared to the poor soul you're pretending to be right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's talk about your teeth first, shall we? Because if you thought modern dentistry was bad, just wait until you meet the medieval version, basically just someone with a pair of pliers and a prayer. It starts with a dull ache. At first you ignore it. Maybe you chalk it up to chewing on tough bread again, or maybe you think it'll pass if you just rinse your mouth with vinegar and spit it out into a bucket. But then the pain gets worse. It throbs, pulses, radiates through your skull like someone is tapping a chisel against your molars. You open your mouth and peer inside, trying to spot the culprit. Unfortunately, you don't have a mirror, so you end up sticking your tongue around, poking at whatever feels swollen or sharp. Spoiler alert, it's probably a cavity or multiple, because toothpaste doesn't exist yet. Neither does dental floss. In fact, most people clean their teeth, if they bother at all, by rubbing them with a rag soaked in salt water or crushed herbs. Some go fancy and use honey mixed with vinegar, thinking it somehow keeps their breath fresh. Spoiler 2, it doesn't. Everyone stinks. Everyone, even the nobles who might splash on rosewater once in a while, still reek of garlic sweat and the faint metallic tang of blood from all the abscesses they refuse to treat. And yes, abscesses. If you make it past 25 without having one, you're doing better than most. These little pockets of pus form under infected teeth, swell in your jaw until you look like you've been punched in the face by a bear. Painkillers. Nope. Antibiotics. Definitely not. All you can do is sit there and hope the thing pops on its own, or worse, ask the local barber to yank the whole tooth out with a rusty pair of pliers. That's right. Barbers were also surgeons back then. They cut hair-pulled teeth and occasionally stitched up wounds, all with the same tools. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually knew how to sterilize their instruments. Some say they boiled them in wine or vinegar. Others believe they just wiped them off on a cloth and called it good. Either way, infections were common, and death from a simple toothache wasn't unheard of. In fact, records show that many people died from untreated dental issues. Sepsis was just another way to go. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about braces. Nobody has straight teeth here. If you're lucky, you'll lose them all before you hit 50 and switch to a diet of porridge and soup. Unless, of course, you fall victim to the latest medieval health trend, crocodile dung toothpaste. Yes, really. Some cultures believe that rubbing powdered crocodile excrement onto your gums would strengthen your teeth. Because why not? It worked about as well as everything else did back then, meaning not at all. So as you clutch your aching jaw and try not to scream, remember this: brushing your teeth twice a day is a luxury, a miracle of modern science, one that prevents you from living in constant agony. Chewing on one side of your mouth like a squirrel storing nuts, and eventually losing every single tooth before you die. But hey, at least your breath will be better than everyone else's. Small victories. Your stomach growls. It's been doing that for a while now, but you've been trying to ignore it. Hunger is normal here. Everyone feels it eventually. But today, you're actually going to eat something. Whether or not that turns out to be a good idea remains to be seen. You shuffle toward the kitchen area, if you can even call it that. There's no refrigerator humming in the corner, no pantry stocked with snacks, just a rough wooden shelf holding whatever food hasn't been stolen by rats or spoiled in the heat. You reach for a hunk of bread. It looks like it's been around since last Tuesday, maybe longer. The crust is rock hard. The inside is dry and crumbly, and somewhere near the bottom there might be a patch of mold that's decided this loaf is its new home. Welcome to medieval cuisine. If you were expecting anything fancy, you're already disappointed. Most people survive on variations of bread, porridge, and whatever scraps they can scrounge up. Meat is rare, unless you're rich, or unless someone managed to poach a deer from the king's forest and hasn't gotten caught yet. Even then, fresh meat is a luxury. More often than not, you're eating salted fish, pickled vegetables, or whatever dried beans you managed to store before they turned into dust. And let's talk about spices. They're everywhere, mostly because they're one of the only things keeping your food from tasting like despair. Salt is expensive, so people use whatever they can find. Garlic, onions, vinegar, mustard seeds, pepper, if you're lucky enough to afford it. Some folks swear by throwing in a handful of crushed herbs just to make their meals slightly less miserable. Others go full mad scientist and start mixing random ingredients together, convinced they've discovered a cure-all potion spoiler they haven't. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually enjoyed their food or just ate it out of sheer necessity. Some records suggest that people developed strong taste preferences despite the limited options, while others believe most meals were endured rather than enjoyed. Either way, you're not exactly dining like royalty. That's reserved for the nobles who get to feast on roasted boar spiced wine and sugar imported from distant lands. Sugar, by the way, is more valuable than gold at this point. But hey, at least you're not drinking water straight from the river, because that would be suicide. See, back then, people knew that drinking untreated water was a bad idea, even if they didn't understand why. So instead of risking cholera or dysentery, they drank ale. Yes, literally. Everyone, children included. Babies sometimes got diluted versions of it because apparently medieval parents thought that was a reasonable substitute for breast milk. So you grab your wooden bowl and ladle in some stew, if you can call it that. It's mostly cabbage, turnips, and a few suspicious bits of meat that might have once belonged to an animal. You stir it half-heartedly and take a bite. It tastes like boiled sadness. But at least it's warm, and at least it's filling. Then again, maybe you should have paid more attention to where that meat came from. Because remember what we said about poaching. If someone did steal a deer and got caught, they could be executed for it, and if they weren't caught right away, they might have hidden the meat somewhere unsanitary until they could sneak it into town under cover of darkness. So yeah, that venison in your stew could be roadkill, could be something worse. Quirky medieval food fact. Some cultures believed that certain foods had magical properties. For example, if you wanted to improve your eyesight, you should eat the eyes of an animal. If you wanted to become stronger, you should eat the heart of a lion, or more realistically, a pig. And if you wanted to impress someone at a banquet, you served them a whole peacock with its feathers reattached after roasting, because nothing says sophistication like pretending the bird is still alive as you carve into it. And speaking of banquets, if you ever get invited to one, and assuming you don't die of food poisoning, you'll be expected to follow strict etiquette rules. No elbows on the table. Don't lick your fingers. Don't stare too long at the roast. And absolutely do not touch the communal dish with your bare hands, unless you want to get thrown out on your ass. Nobles had servants bring out elaborate dishes, complete with sauces made from crushed almond saffron, and sometimes even ground glass, because apparently adding texture was important. But you're not a noble. You're just trying to survive another day without starving or getting sick. And considering how many people drop dead from foodborne illness, that's not an easy task. Without refrigeration, preservation methods are limited. Meat gets salted, smoked, or left to rot in a barrel until it develops a flavor so intense it makes your eyes water. Cheese is aged until it becomes a solid block of funk. Bread gets infested with weevils unless you keep it sealed in a clay jar, which doesn't always work anyway. Oh, and if you're feeling adventurous and decide to try something exotic like citrus fruit or cinnamon, you better be ready to pay through the nose. These items are imported from faraway places like the Middle East or India, carried across treacherous seas and war-torn roads by merchants who probably lost half their cargo along the way. By the time these goods reach your local market, if they make it at all, they're considered luxury items reserved for the ultra-rich. So as you sit there chewing on your sad little meal, you realize something. This isn't just about survival. This is about endurance. Every single day you're making choices between starvation and sickness, between blandness and poison, between hunger and regret. And somehow, people manage to live through it. Somehow, they raise families, build homes, and pass down traditions that will shape the world centuries later. But none of that matters right now. Right now, you just want something that doesn't taste like disappointment. You finish your meal or what passes for one and immediately regret it. Not because of the taste, though, that's bad enough, but because you can feel something crawling on your skin. It's not just in your head. You are crawling. Lice, fleas, and every other imaginable parasite have made themselves at home in your clothes, under your fingernails, and probably even in your hair. If you've been living here long enough, welcome to medieval hygiene, where the concept of clean is more of a vague suggestion than an actual goal. If someone smells particularly bad, people don't comment on it. It's just normal. Everyone stinks. Even the nobles who might splash a bit of rose water behind their ears once in a while still reek of sweat mildew and whatever weird oils they rub into their skin thinking it makes them smell better. Spoiler, it doesn't. Bathing is rare, like special occasion, rare. If you're lucky, you get washed down with a bucket of lukewarm water once a month, maybe more, if you live near a river or a public bathhouse. And yes, there were bathhouses back then. Some cities had entire complexes where people could soak in communal tubs, steam rooms, and even get massages. But those places were eventually shut down by religious authorities who decided that having too much fun while naked was morally corrupting. So now instead of regular bathing, people just change their shirts occasionally and hope that layering helps mask the stench. Quirky medieval hygiene fact. Some cultures believed that submerging your body in water was dangerous because it opened your pores and allowed disease to seep inside. Instead of washing, people preferred to rub themselves down with scented cloths soaked in vinegar or wine, convinced that this somehow kept them clean without risking illness. Others went full mad scientist and started experimenting with perfumes made from crushed flowers, animal musk, and sometimes even human urine, because apparently nothing says fresh, like rubbing old piss on yourself. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually enjoyed smelling bad or just got used to it over time. After all, if everyone around you smells the same way, maybe it doesn't seem so bad. Still, records show that travelers often commented on how awful European cities smelled compared to places like the Middle East, where public baths were more common and personal hygiene was taken seriously. Meanwhile, here in medieval Europe, the streets are filled with the scent of rotting food, animal dung, and unwashed bodies pressed together in tight little clusters of misery. So you take a deep breath, bad idea, and immediately regret it. The air is thick with the stink of sweat smoke and whatever foul concoction someone nearby is brewing in a pot. There's no deodorant, no soap, no laundry detergent. Your clothes haven't been washed in weeks, maybe months. Every fiber of your existence reeks, and there's nothing you can do about it. And let's talk about toilets, or rather, the complete lack of them. Most people just squat behind a bush when nature calls. Or if they're feeling fancy, they use a chamber pot and dump the contents out the window. Yes, really, that's a thing. People toss their bodily waste straight into the street, like it's no big deal, which honestly it isn't. Everyone does it. There's no sewage system, no plumbing, no flushing anything anywhere. Just open gutters running down the middle of the road filled with trash feces and the occasional dead rat. If you're rich, you might have access to a privy, a wooden seat built over a hole in the ground. Sometimes these holes connect to underground tunnels that lead to cesspits which occasionally overflow during heavy rains, turning the streets into rivers of filth. If you're unlucky enough to be standing in the wrong place when that happens, well, enjoy your new shoes. Some castles and monasteries had rudimentary drainage systems, but they weren't exactly high-tech. Waste would drop directly into a moat or river below, ensuring that the people living downstream would be drinking contaminated water for generations to come. Charming. And speaking of water getting clean, water is another nightmare. Wells are often located near graveyards or livestock pens, meaning they're regularly contaminated with bacteria. If you're not drinking ale to avoid sickness, you're taking your chances with whatever comes out of the pump. Boiling water is an option, but that requires fuel, and firewood isn't free. So most people just drink what's available and hope for the best. Which brings us to teeth again, because, of course, everything circles back to your mouth eventually. With no toothbrush, no fluoride, and absolutely zero concern for oral hygiene, your breath is already bad enough. Now imagine what happens when you combine that with poor sanitation, spoiled food, and the ever-present risk of contracting some horrifying disease from touching a doorknob. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we talked about earlier? Yeah, that wasn't a real thing. But crocodile dung was used as toothpaste in some cultures, which means medieval people were literally rubbing ancient reptile poop onto their gums in hopes of keeping their teeth intact. Because why not? At least it's organic. So as you sit there, scratching at your lice-infested scalp and trying not to inhale too deeply, you realize something. Cleanliness may be next to godliness, but in the Middle Ages, survival is next to impossible. Every day is a battle against filth, disease, and the slow, inevitable decay of your own body. And yet people manage to live through it. Somehow they raise families, build homes, and pass down traditions that will shape the world centuries later. But none of that matters right now. Right now, you just want a shower. A real one. One with hot water soap and maybe even a towel that hasn't been used by 5 different people before you. Too bad that won't happen for another few hundred years. You scratch your arm again and again. No matter how many times you do it, the itch doesn't go away, it just gets worse. You pull back your sleeve and peer at your skin. There, nestled in the folds of your grimy tunic, is a tiny black speck with legs. It's moving. Fast before you can react, it vanishes into the fabric, leaving behind a red welt that throbs like a fresh bruise. Welcome to daily life with fleas, the unofficial rulers of medieval Europe. These little bloodsuckers aren't just annoying, they're everywhere. In your clothes, in your hair, in your bed, on your pets, on your livestock, even crawling across the floorboards under your feet. If you think you've found a place without them, you're wrong. They're just hiding, waiting, watching, and they don't travel alone. Fleas bring friends, lice, ticks, mites, and every other imaginable parasite that thrives in warm, sweaty bodies coated in layers of filth. Lice in particular are the ultimate survivors. They cling to your scalp, burrow into your eyebrows, nestle into the seams of your clothing, and reproduce at an alarming rate. A single female louse can lay up to 10 eggs a day, which means if you find one, you probably already have a full-blown infestation. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually tried to get rid of these pests, or just accepted them as part of life. Some records suggest that people used combs made from bone or wood to try and remove lice. But considering how often they bathed, or rather how infrequently, it's unlikely those efforts were very effective. Others believed that certain herbs could repel insects, so they rubbed crushed garlic thyme or even pigeon droppings onto their skin in hopes of keeping the bugs away. Spoiler, it didn't work. Quirky medieval pest fact. Some cultures thought that lice were actually good for you. They believed that parasites absorb disease from your body, essentially acting as natural medicine by sucking out your bad humors. So instead of trying to get rid of them, people let them feast freely, convinced that a lousy head was a healthy one. But fleas and lice are just the beginning. Oh no, there's more. Much more ticks crawl through the tall grass outside, waiting for an unsuspecting victim to pass by so they can latch on and swell up with blood until they look like tiny engorged grapes. Mites burrow into your skin, causing relentless itching and rashes that drive you mad. Bedbugs hide in the seams of your mattress, emerging at night to feed on your exposed flesh while you sleep. And then there are the worms, tapeworms, roundworms, hookworms, all happily making themselves at home in your intestines, feasting off whatever scraps of food manage to make it past your rotting teeth. Yes, intestinal parasites were incredibly common in the Middle Ages. Without proper sanitation, contaminated food and water spread microscopic eggs that hatched inside your gut, turning your insides into a writhing jungle of creepy crawlies. Some people lived their whole lives unaware of the invaders squirming inside them, suffering from constant stomach pain, fatigue, and malnutrition without knowing why. Others weren't so lucky. They coughed up worms past them in their stool or felt strange movements beneath their skin as larvae migrated through their organs. So, what did people do about all this? Well, not much. The concept of germs hadn't been discovered yet, so nobody understood that invisible creatures were responsible for all this misery. Instead, they blamed everything on bad air, evil spirits, or divine punishment. Treatments ranged from the mildly ineffective to the absolutely horrifying. Some people drank herbal teas in the hopes of purging the parasites, while others subjected themselves to bloodletting, a practice based on the idea that removing bad blood would somehow fix everything. Spoiler, it didn't. If anything, it made things worse. If you were rich enough to afford a physician, they might prescribe you something truly bizarre, like drinking powdered unicorn horn, which was just rhinoceros horn, or swallowing crushed beetle shells mixed with honey, because apparently, if you couldn't see the problem, the solution must be magical. But none of this helps you right now. Right now you're sitting here covered in bites, scratching yourself raw and wondering how anyone survived this nightmare. The answer, unfortunately, is simple. Most people didn't. Parasites weakened, immune systems spread diseases, and contributed to chronic illness that shortened lifespans. Children were especially vulnerable. Many didn't live past their 5th birthday thanks to unchecked infections and malnutrition caused by internal pests. And yet, despite all this, people managed to carry on. They built homes, raised families, worked the fields, and fought wars while being constantly tormented by tiny, hungry monsters clinging to every inch of their bodies. They learned to live with the itch, the sting, the the relentless invasion of their personal space by creatures that saw them as nothing more than walking buffets. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about getting bitten by a plague-carrying flea. Unless, of course, you happen to be living in the middle of a bubonic plague outbreak, which, if we're being honest, is entirely possible. Because remember, this is the Middle Ages. Things can always get worse. You wake up with a splitting headache, your throat raw, and every joint in your body aching, like you've been dragged behind a horse for a week. You try to sit up, but the room spins around you, nausea curling in your stomach like a coiled serpent. You're burning with fever, yet shivering at the same time. This isn't just a bad night's sleep. This is something worse. And now the real nightmare begins. Because in the Middle Ages, when you get sick, there's no doctor waiting on speed dial, no antibiotics to knock out infections, no painkillers to dull the agony. Instead, you get leeches, lots of them, fat, squirming, blood-sucking leeches that someone will press against your skin while chanting prayers and muttering about humors. Yes, welcome to medieval medicine, or as it was known back then. Let's see what happens if we apply this. The entire medical system is built on the ancient theory of the four humors: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to this philosophy, illness occurs when these bodily fluids fall out of balance. So naturally, the solution is to bleed the patient until they're practically translucent. Bloodletting becomes your go-to treatment, whether you have a fever, a cough, or just feel vaguely unwell. The more blood you lose, the healthier you'll supposedly become. So here you are lying on a wooden table in some dimly lit chamber, watching as a barber surgeon, because barbers did surgery back then, pulls a jar of wriggling leeches from a shelf and starts pressing them against your arms, legs, and maybe even your forehead, if they're feeling extra ambitious. The leeches latch on their little mouths, burrowing into your flesh as they feast greedily on your blood, and you grit your teeth and hope this somehow makes you feel better. Spoiler, it doesn't. Much more ticks crawl through the tall grass outside, waiting for an unsuspecting victim to pass by so they can latch on and swell up with blood until they look like tiny engorged grapes. Mites burrow into your skin, causing relentless itching and rashes that drive you mad. Bedbugs hide in the seams of your mattress, emerging at night to feed on your exposed flesh while you sleep. And then there are the worms, tapeworms, roundworms, hookworms, all happily making themselves at home in your intestines, feasting off whatever scraps of food managed to make it past your rotting teeth. Yes, intestinal parasites were incredibly common in the Middle Ages. Without proper sanitation, contaminated food and water spread microscopic eggs that hatched inside your gut, turning your insides into a writhing jungle of creepy crawlies. Some people lived their whole lives unaware of the invaders squirming inside them, suffering from constant stomach pain, fatigue, and malnutrition. Without knowing why, others weren't so lucky. They coughed up worms past them in their stool or felt strange movements beneath their skin as larvae migrated through their organs. So what did people do about all this? Well, not much. The concept of germs hadn't been discovered yet, so nobody understood that invisible creatures were responsible for all this misery. Instead, they blamed everything on bad air, evil spirits, or divine punishment. Treatments ranged from the mildly ineffective to the absolutely horrifying. Some people drank herbal teas in the hopes of purging the parasites, while others subjected themselves to bloodletting a practice based on the idea that removing bad blood would somehow fix everything. Spoiler, it didn't. If anything, it made things worse. If you were rich enough to afford a physician, they might prescribe you something truly bizarre, like drinking powdered unicorn horn, which was just rhinoceros horn, or swallowing crushed beetle shells mixed with honey. Because apparently, if you couldn't see the problem, the solution must be magical. But none of this helps you right now. Right, now you're sitting here covered in bites, scratching yourself raw, and wondering how anyone survived this nightmare. The answer, unfortunately, is simple. Most people didn't. Parasites weakened immune systems, spread diseases, and contributed to chronic illness that shortened lifespans. Children were especially vulnerable. Many didn't live past their 5th birthday, thanks to unchecked infections and malnutrition caused by internal pests. And yet, despite all this, people managed to carry on. They built homes, raised families, worked the fields, and fought wars while being constantly tormented by tiny, hungry monsters clinging to every inch of their bodies. They learned to live with the itch, the sting, the relentless invasion of their personal space by creatures that saw them as nothing more than walking buffets. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about getting bitten by a plague-carrying flea. Unless, of course, you happen to be living in the middle of a bubonic plague outbreak, which, if we're being honest, is entirely possible. Because, remember, this is the Middle Ages. Things can always get worse. You wake up with a splitting headache, your throat raw, and every joint in your body aching like you've been dragged behind a horse for a week. You try to sit up, but the room spins around you, nausea curling in your stomach like a coiled serpent. You're burning with fever, yet shivering at the same time. This isn't just a bad night's sleep. This is something worse. And now the real nightmare begins. Because in the Middle Ages, when you get sick, there's no doctor waiting on speed dial, no antibiotics to knock out infections, no painkillers to dull the agony. Instead, you get leeches, lots of them, fat, squirming blood, sucking leeches that someone will press against your skin while chanting prayers and muttering about humors. Yes, welcome to medieval medicine, or as it was known back then. Let's see what happens if we apply this. The entire medical system is built on the ancient theory of the 4 humors: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to this philosophy, illness occurs when these bodily fluids fall out of balance. So naturally, the solution is to bleed the patient until they're practically translucent. Bloodletting becomes your go-to treatment. Whether you have a fever, a cough, or just feel vaguely unwell, the more blood you lose, the healthier you'll supposedly become. So here you are lying on a wooden table in some dimly lit chamber, watching as a barber surgeon, because barbers did surgery back then, pulls a jar of wriggling leeches from a shelf and starts pressing them against your arms, legs, and maybe even your forehead, if they're feeling extra ambitious. The leeches latch on their little mouths, burrowing into your flesh as they feast greedily on your blood, and you grit your teeth and hope this somehow makes you feel better. Spoiler, it doesn't. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually believed leeches were effective or if they just thought suffering through blood loss was preferable to whatever disease was trying to kill them. Some records suggest that physicians kept detailed urine charts. Yes, they studied pee for hours, looking for signs of imbalance and prescribed treatments based on how dark or cloudy it appeared. Others relied heavily on astrology, believing that the position of the stars could influence which vein should be cut and how much blood should be removed. Because why not if the moon says you need more bleeding? Who are you to argue? Quirky medieval medicine fact. Some cultures believed that certain diseases could be cured by ingesting powdered human bones or drinking fresh blood from a freshly executed criminal. Yes, really, they thought that consuming parts of strong, healthy individuals would transfer their vitality to the sick. So if you ever find yourself in the middle of a public execution, don't be surprised if someone rushes forward with a cup, hoping to catch a splash of warm, life-giving crimson. But leeches and bloodletting are just the beginning. Oh no, there's so much worse ahead. If your symptoms persist, your physician might recommend purging, meaning they'll force you to vomit or give you a powerful laxative to empty your bowels. Again, this is all part of balancing those elusive humors. The idea is that if you can expel enough waste from your body, the sickness will leave with it. In reality, you just end up dehydrated, weak, and possibly even closer to death. If you're lucky, your treatment includes herbal remedies. Some of these actually work. Honey has antibacterial properties. Willow bark contains salicin. The precursor to aspirin and garlic does have mild antimicrobial effects. But most of the time you're being fed bizarre concoctions made from crushed beetles, dried animal dung, or ground up seashells mixed with vinegar and wine. Because apparently, if it smells awful and tastes worse, it must be doing something. And let's not forget the role of religion in healing. If your local physician can't cure you, you turn to the church. Priests and monks serve as healers, offering prayers, blessings, and holy relics in hopes of divine intervention. Some patients are anointed with oil, blessed by a bishop. Others are given consecrated bread or water believed to contain healing powers. If you're particularly devout, you might even make a pilgrimage to a shrine or cathedral, dragging your sick body across miles of rough terrain in hopes that God will take pity on you. Of course, none of this helps if you're suffering from something truly deadly. There's no vaccine for smallpox, no penicillin for bacterial infections, no surgery for internal injuries beyond crude amputations performed with a rusted knife, and no anesthesia. If you break a leg, you're probably going to die from infection. If you contract plague, you're definitely going to die after days of agonizing pain, swollen lymph nodes, and violent vomiting fits that leave you curled up in your own filth. And heaven help you if you start showing symptoms of something mysterious, mental illness, epilepsy, seizures. All of these conditions are lumped together under the umbrella of demonic possession or witchcraft. If you start acting strangely, convulsing, or claiming to hear voices, someone is going to accuse you of consorting with the devil. And once that happens, your chances of survival drop to zero. So as you lie there, weak and drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling, while another leech detaches itself from your arm and drops onto the floor with a wet plop, you realize something getting sick in the Middle Ages is basically a death sentence. Unless you're one of the lucky few who managed to survive through sheer stubbornness, natural immunity, or the occasional stroke of good fortune, you're not making it out alive. But hey, at least you didn't get diagnosed with the falling sickness. That's medieval code for epilepsy. And if you start having seizures in public, someone's going to drag you to the nearest priest and demand an exorcism. You wake up to the sound of bells, not the cheerful kind that ring at weddings or town festivals. No, these are deep, solemn tolls echoing through the village like a funeral procession. It's Sunday morning, and whether you feel like it or not, it's time for church again. Because in the Middle Ages, religion isn't just something you do on Sundays, it's everything. It dictates what you eat, when you work, who you marry, how you die, and whether or not your soul gets to go to heaven instead of burning forever in eternal torment. God is watching, the devil is lurking, and if you so much as sneeze during Mass, someone's going to accuse you of being possessed. So with aching joints, a stomach full of yesterday's questionable stew, and a head still buzzing from last night's fever dreams. Or was that divine punishment? You drag yourself out of bed and into your one good tunic, the slightly less stained one that you only wear for special occasions like religious services and public executions. The church looms over the village like a stern parent, its stone walls towering above the thatched roofs of peasant homes. Inside, the air smells like candle wax damp wood and the collective sweat of dozens of unwashed bodies crammed together in tight pews. The priest stands at the altar, dressed in ornate robes, stitched with gold thread, holding a silver chalice that probably cost more than your entire house. He speaks in Latin, a language most people don't understand, but no matter you're expected to listen, nod and pretend you know exactly what he's saying. Because questioning anything about the church, that's dangerous. Heresy is a capital offense. If you start asking too many questions about why bread turns into flesh, or why confession costs money, someone might decide you've been influenced by Satan himself. And once that happens, there's no coming back. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed every single doctrine preached from the pulpit, or if they just went along with it to avoid getting burned at the stake. Some records suggest that faith was deeply ingrained in daily life, shaping everything from farming practices to medical treatments. Others believe that many people simply followed tradition without truly understanding the theology behind it, treating religion more like superstition than spiritual devotion. Quirky medieval religion fact: some towns had dancing plagues, where groups of people would start dancing uncontrollably in the streets, convinced that they were cursed by God and needed to move until they collapsed from exhaustion. Priests would sometimes join in believing that prayer could stop the madness. Spoiler, it didn't. People kept dancing until they dropped dead from dehydration and heart failure, but church isn't just about salvation. It's also big business. Confession doesn't come free. If you want to be forgiven for your sins, you better have some coins handy. Indulgences, official pardons for wrongdoing, are sold like luxury goods, promising reduced time in purgatory in exchange for generous donations to the church. Want to guarantee your place in heaven? Buy an indulgence? Want to ensure your dead relatives aren't suffering in the afterlife? Buy more indulgences. Need a new roof for your local cathedral. Surprise! You're paying for it whether you like it or not. And let's not forget relics. Churches across Europe claim to possess holy objects with miraculous powers. Pieces of the true cross, strands of Mary's hair, bones of saints, even supposed drops of Christ's blood preserved in jars. Some of these items are obviously fake. There are enough pieces of the true cross scattered across Europe to build an entire ship, but nobody dares question their authenticity. Because, again, doubting the power of relics could get you labeled a heretic. If you're lucky enough to live near a monastery, monks serve as both scholars and healers, copying ancient texts by hand and brewing medicinal herbs in their gardens. But monastic life isn't all peace and quiet. Monks take strict vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, meaning no sex, no personal possessions, and absolutely no arguing with the abbot who rules the monastery like a feudal lord. Women who choose religious life become nuns living in enclosed convents under strict supervision. While some find solace in the structured routine of prayer and service, others suffer under harsh discipline forced into the convent against their will because their families couldn't afford a dowry. Marriage is expensive, and sending a daughter to a convent is often seen as a cheaper alternative. And speaking of marriage, if you thought romance played any role in medieval relationships, think again. Marriages are arranged for political alliances, land inheritance, and financial security. Love is optional. At best, outright discouraged. At worst, women are considered property, passed from father to husband with little say in the matter. Divorce? Absolutely not. Once you're married, you're stuck for better or worse in sickness and in health, until death does you part. Which brings us to death. Oh yes, death is everywhere, and when it comes, the church is ready. Last rites must be performed before you pass, ensuring your soul has the best chance at salvation. If you die suddenly without receiving final absolution, well, good luck explaining that to St. Peter at the gates of heaven. So, as you kneel on the cold stone floor of the church, clutching your rosary beads and trying not to scratch the fleas crawling up your legs, you realize something. This isn't just a religion. This is a way of life, a system of control wrapped in the guise of divine authority. Every aspect of your existence is dictated by faith, fear, and the ever-present threat of eternal damnation. And yet, despite all the restrictions, the taxes, the punishments, and the constant reminders that you're nothing but a sinful wretch in need of redemption, people cling to their beliefs. They pray, they fast, they make pilgrimages, they give alms, they suffer in silence, all for the hope of something better beyond this miserable earthly life. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about going to hell unless you commit a mortal sin, which, considering how many rules there are, is basically everything. The sun rises, and so do you, whether you want to or not. There's no hitting snooze, no lazy mornings wrapped in a warm blanket, no coffee brewing on the stove. The rooster crows, the pigs squeal, and somewhere nearby, someone is already swinging an axe into a log. Like they've got something to prove. Your day starts now, whether your body is ready for it or not. Because in the Middle Ages, rest is a luxury, and you don't have time for luxuries. You've got work to do. If you're a peasant, which you probably are, your life revolves around labor. From sunrise to sunset, every waking moment is spent toiling under the weight of survival. There's no such thing as weekends, no concept of vacation, no paid sick leave. If you stop working, you starve. Simple as that. So you grab your scythe, your hoe, or whatever tool of misery you use most often, and head out into the fields. The air is cold, damp with morning dew, and filled with the scent of freshly turned earth. Somewhere in the distance, oxen bellow as they strain against their harnesses, pulling wooden plows through stubborn soil. A few feet away, children as young as 6 are already helping with chores, gathering eggs, chasing stray goats, or stacking bundles of hay. Work doesn't start at dawn because people love productivity. It starts at dawn because there isn't enough daylight to waste. Every second of sunlight is precious, and if you don't make the most of it, your crops won't grow, your animals won't eat, and you'll be one step closer to starvation. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually enjoyed any form of leisure time or if their lives were nothing but relentless toil. Some records suggest that festivals, church holidays, and harvest celebrations provided occasional breaks from labor, but for the most part, work was constant. Even during winter, when farming slows down, there's always something to do. Chopping wood, repairing tools, mending clothes, or preparing food for the months ahead. Quirky medieval work fact: some villages had lazy laws, one where officials would punish those caught idling instead of working. If you were found loafing around without a good excuse, you might get fined, publicly shamed, or even forced into physical labor as punishment. Because, apparently, doing absolutely nothing was considered a crime back then. But let's talk about what you're actually doing all day. If you're a farmer, you spend your hours bent over in the dirt, planting seeds by hand, weeding fields until your fingers bleed, and harvesting crops under the beating sun. You carry heavy loads of grain, haul buckets of water, and chase off birds that think your hard-earned food is a free buffet. And if you're lucky enough to own livestock, you deal with the never-ending cycle of feeding, milking, cleaning, and butchering animals that provide your family with sustenance. If you're a craftsman instead of a farmer, your hands are just as calloused, but your work is different. Blacksmiths hammer glowing metal into shape, their skin blistered from flying sparks. Shoemakers stitch leather together with needle-thick awls pricking their fingers more times than they can count. Carpenters saw logs until their arms ache, while weavers thread fabric on looms that click and clack all day long. No matter your trade, exhaustion is inevitable, and let's not forget the women. While men handle field work and construction, women take on their own grueling responsibilities, cooking meals over open fires, grinding grain into flour, fetching water from distant wells, and caring for children who are constantly getting sick from all the filth and parasites floating around. They also help with farm tasks, mend clothing, and preserve food for the winter. Their work may not always be acknowledged in historical records, but it's just as essential to survival. Children aren't spared from the grind either. As soon as they're old enough to walk, they're expected to contribute. Toddlers gather firewood. Older kids herd sheep, and teenagers learn trades from their parents, working alongside them until their bodies wear down, just like the adult's education, only for the wealthy. Most kids grow up illiterate, learning only what they need to survive, not how to read, but how to plant, reap, and endure. So after a full day of back-breaking labor, you finally return home, your muscles ache, your hands are raw, and your stomach growls from hunger. Dinner is simple, if you even have one. Maybe some bread, maybe a bowl of thin stew, made from whatever scraps you could scrounge up. You collapse onto your straw mattress, too exhausted to care about the lice crawling across your skin or the rats nibbling at the corners of your hut. And tomorrow, same thing, again and again and again. There's no retirement, no savings account, no safety net. You work until your body gives out, and if you're lucky, you live long enough to see your children inherit the same miserable existence. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about burnout, because burnout implies you had a choice in the first place. You wake up to the sound of crying. Not just one child, multiple voices, high-pitched and desperate, echoing through the tiny hut like a chorus of suffering souls. Somewhere near your feet a baby wails, its face red with frustration. A little older sibling tugs at your sleeve, begging for food or attention or something you don't have time to give, because in the Middle Ages, children aren't just miniature adults. They're workers, commodities, and more often than not, disappointments. Childhood is short, brutal, and filled with expectations that would make modern parents shudder. If you're lucky enough to survive infancy, you're immediately thrown into the cycle of labor, poverty, and disease that defines everyday life. Let's start with the obvious. Most kids don't even make it past their first birthday. Infant mortality rates are staggering. Somewhere around 25% to 30% of babies die before they turn 1. And if they survive, that half of them won't live past 5. Malnutrition, infections, parasites, accidents, you name it, and it's probably going to kill them. There's no formula, no vaccines, no antibiotics. If a child gets sick, they either get better on their own or they don't. Historians still argue whether medieval parents actually formed strong emotional bonds with their children, considering how many of them died young. Some records suggest that people didn't name babies until after the first few weeks, just in case they didn't make it. Others indicate that parents grieved deeply when children passed away, despite knowing the risks. Either way, love and loss go hand in hand in this world quirky medieval childhood fact. Some cultures believed that wrapping infants in tight swaddling clothes would help them grow straight and strong. So babies were bound from head to toe in cloth, barely able to move sometimes for months at a time. The idea was that it kept them disciplined, but in reality, it probably just made them miserable and prone to circulation problems. Once a child makes it past infancy, things don't exactly get easier. There's no concept of childhood as we know it today. Kids don't play with toys or learn to read unless they're born into wealth. Instead, they work. From the moment they can walk, they're expected to contribute to the household. Toddlers gather firewood, fetch water, chase stray animals, or watch over younger siblings while their parents toil in the fields. By age 6 or 7, they're doing real labor herding. Sheep, grinding grain, helping in the kitchen, or apprenticing under a craftsman. If they're lucky enough to be trained in a trade, and let's talk about education, or rather the complete lack of it. Unless you're the son of a noble or clergy member, you're not learning Latin, philosophy, or arithmetic. You're learning how to survive, how to plant seeds, how to milk cows, how to mend clothes, how to avoid getting beaten by your master if you mess up an apprenticeship. Literacy is practically non-existent among peasants. Most people never learn to read or write, and if they do, it's only because a priest or monk took pity on them and offered some basic instruction. Girls have it even worse. They're seen as property, destined for marriage and motherhood as soon as possible. A girl might be engaged by age 12 and married off by 14, thrust into adulthood before she's even had a chance to understand what's happening to her body. Once married, she's expected to bear children constantly, on average every 2 years or so, until menopause or death takes her. And given the dangers of childbirth, neither option is particularly appealing. Boys, meanwhile, are sent off to serve as pages or apprentices, depending on their social status. If they're lucky, they'll train under a knight, learning combat skills and etiquette in hopes of becoming a squire someday. If they're less fortunate, they'll apprentice under a blacksmith, shoemaker, or baker, working long hours for little pay and constant discipline. Abuse isn't uncommon, especially in households where masters see apprentices as expendable labor rather than actual human beings. And then there's playtime, if you can even call it that. Children don't have plastic toys or board games. They make their own entertainment with sticks, rocks, and whatever scraps they can find. Some villages hold festivals or games during religious holidays. But otherwise, fun is a luxury. Most of the time, kids are too tired, too hungry, or too sick to enjoy themselves. But hey, at least they don't have to worry about school tests, or homework, or standardized exams. Because, again, none of that exists. Education is for the elite. Everyone else just try not to die before puberty. So as you sit there watching another generation of children grow up in the same miserable conditions that shaped your own life, you realize something. Survival isn't just about enduring hardship. It's about passing it down generation after generation. People live and die without ever escaping the cycle of poverty, disease, and labor that defines their existence. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about teenage rebellion. Most kids don't live long enough to become teenagers. You stand at the edge of a crowded village square watching as two people, probably not much older than you are, join together in what's supposed to be a sacred union. The priest speaks Latin, which nobody understands. But everyone nods along anyway because that's what you do when religion is involved. There are no flowers, no music, no cake, just a few coins exchanged between families and a handshake that seals your fate. Welcome to medieval marriage, the original version of Until Death Do Us Part, where love has absolutely nothing to do with it. Because here's the thing, marriage isn't about romance. It's about land power, money, and survival. If you're lucky enough to be born into nobility, your entire life has probably been planned out since childhood. You were promised to someone else before you even knew what sex was, all so your family could merge, estates form political alliances, or strengthen their claim to whatever patch of dirt they consider home. And if you're a peasant, well, things aren't much better. Sure, you might have some say in who you marry, but only within strict limits. Your options are whoever lives nearby, whoever can afford to feed another mouth, and whoever doesn't already have a prearranged contract tying them to someone else. Love, that's for poets and dreamers. Most people don't even know their spouse very well before the wedding. They just show up, say their vows, and start popping out kids, like it's their job, which technically it is. Historians still argue whether medieval marriages were entirely devoid of affection or if couples sometimes grew fond of each other over time. Some records suggest that arranged unions could lead to strong partnerships, especially when both parties worked together to survive harsh conditions. Others indicate that many marriages were miserable affairs filled with resentment, infidelity, and outright abuse. Either way, divorce isn't an option. Once you're married, you're stuck for better or worse in sickness and in health until death finally separates you. Quirky medieval marriage fact. Some cultures believed that a woman's worth could be measured by how many children she produced. If she couldn't conceive, she was often blamed for the failure and accused of witchcraft or divine punishment. Meanwhile, men who couldn't father children rarely held accountable, because of course they weren't. Let's talk about the ceremony itself. Weddings aren't big, extravagant events unless you're royalty. For most people, the whole thing lasts maybe an hour, tops. There's a blessing, some prayers, a ring, if you can afford one, and then everyone goes back to work. No reception, no dancing, no honeymoon, just a quick change in legal status and a new set of responsibilities. And let's not forget the dowry. If you're a bride, your family is expected to provide something valuable to your husband upon marriage, usually land, livestock, or money. This is supposed to compensate him for taking you on as if women are some kind of burden rather than actual human beings. If your family can't come up with a sufficient dowry, you might end up being sent to a convent instead. Not exactly a great alternative, considering monastic life means giving up sex, personal freedom, and any chance of having children. If you're a groom, you're expected to provide a bride price, a payment made to the bride's family in exchange for her hand. But again, this isn't about love, it's about ownership. Women are treated as property, passed from father to husband, with little say in the matter. Consent, not really a thing. A girl as young as 12 could be married off without protest, especially if her family needs the alliance or the financial boost. Once married, things don't get any easier. Husbands are considered the head of the household, meaning they make all the decisions while wives are expected to obey. Domestic abuse isn't illegal. It's just seen as normal discipline, like punishing a disobedient child. Adultery is a major offense, but only for women. Men can sleep around all they want as long as they keep it discreet. Women, on the other hand, face severe punishments if caught cheating, including public humiliation, exile, or even execution. And speaking of adultery, extramarital affairs are shockingly common. Nobles have mistresses. Knights fall in love with ladies in waiting, and peasants sneak off with neighbors whenever they can. Affairs are usually kept secret, but when they're discovered, they can lead to violence, duels, or full-blown scandals that ruin reputations. But hey, at least there's always the church to turn to for help. Confession costs money, though, so if you want forgiveness for your sins, you'd better have some coins handy. And if you're truly desperate, if your marriage is unbearable, if your spouse is abusive, if you just want out, you can try petitioning for an annulment. But good luck with that. Annulments are rare, expensive, and require proof that the marriage wasn't consummated or that one party committed fraud. So unless you can convince a priest that your wife never took off her dress on your wedding night, you're probably stuck. So as you watch yet another couple tie the knot under the watchful eyes of their families and the church, you realize something. Marriage in the Middle Ages isn't about happiness. It's about obligation, control, and survival. Whether you're a noble bound by politics or a peasant barely scraping by your wedding day, marks the beginning of a lifelong partnership built on duty rather than love. And if you're unlucky enough to be married to someone who hates you well, enjoy the next 50 years of misery. You stand in the village square, hands bound behind your back, as a crowd of angry faces watches you with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright glee. The local lord sits on a raised wooden platform, his face carved from the same stone as the castle walls behind him. A priest mutters prayers under his breath, while a scribe scribbles notes on a parchment that will supposedly record your crime for posterity. But let's be honest, this isn't about justice, this is about power. Welcome to medieval law enforcement, where trials are quick, punishments are brutal, and mercy is something reserved for people who can afford it. If you've been accused of wrongdoing, whether it's stealing bread, insulting a noble, or simply looking suspicious, You don't get a lawyer, a jury, or even a fair chance to defend yourself. Instead, you get one of two options: trial by ordeal or trial by combat. Trial by ordeal. That's when they test your innocence by making you suffer. Want to prove you didn't steal that chicken? Great. Here's a red-hot iron rod. Carry it for a few seconds, and if your wounds heal cleanly within 3 days, God has deemed you innocent. If not, well, guess you were guilty after all. Or maybe you'd prefer dunking. That's right. Throw someone into a river and see if they float. If they do, they're obviously a witch. If they sink, well, at least they're dead. So the problem is solved either way. Historians still argue whether these trials were genuinely believed to reveal divine judgment, or if they were just convenient ways to eliminate inconvenient people without having to deal with pesky evidence. Either way, they weren't exactly fair. And if you were poor, uneducated, or otherwise powerless, your chances of surviving an ordeal were slim to none. Quirky medieval justice fact. Some towns had trial by bread, where suspects were forced to swallow a dry piece of communion bread. If they choked, they were guilty. If they managed to swallow it, they were innocent, because apparently choking on holy carbs was a reliable indicator of moral character. If you somehow survive the ordeal, or if your case goes to a more traditional court, you might end up facing a panel of local nobles or clergy members who serve as judges. These guys aren't trained legal experts. They're landowners and priests who make decisions based on personal bias, superstition, and whatever rumors they've heard floating around town. There's no concept of innocent until proven guilty. You're guilty until you can convince someone with money and influence to vouch for you. And if you're poor, well, good luck with that. Because here's the thing, justice in the Middle Ages wasn't blind. It was heavily influenced by social class. Nobles could buy their way out of punishment, pay fines instead of serving time, or simply use their status to avoid consequences altogether. Peasants, not so much. If you're caught stealing, you lose a hand. If you commit treason, you get hanged, drawn, and quartered. If you insult someone important, you might find yourself tied to a post and whipped until your skin turns to ribbons. Punishments are meant to be public spectacles, lessons for anyone else who dares to break the rules. Hangings are common, but they're not always quick. Sometimes the rope is too long, and the condemned person slowly strangles to death over several minutes. Other times, the rope is too short, and the executioner has to yank them down manually to finish the job. Either way, it's horrifying. Then there's branding. If you're lucky enough to avoid execution, you might get branded with a hot iron to mark you as a criminal for life. Burned flesh, screaming pain, and a permanent reminder that society has officially decided you're trash. And if you think prison is a better alternative, think again. Jails aren't designed for rehabilitation. They're dungeons. Dark, damp cells filled with rats' disease and the occasional corpse left to rot in the corner. Food is scarce, sanitation is non-existent, and guards are paid mostly in bribes. If you can't afford to pay your way out, you'll probably die in there before anyone decides what to do with you. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about overcrowding, because most prisoners don't live long enough to take up space for very long. So as you kneel before the judge, waiting for your fate to be decided, you realize something. This isn't justice, this is theater. A performance designed to remind everyone who holds power and who doesn't. Laws exist to protect the wealthy, punish the poor, and keep the social order intact. And if you're standing here today, it means you've already lost. You step into your home, if you can even call it that. The air is thick with the scent of damp wood, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely sour that might be last night's stew, or maybe just mold creeping up the walls. There's no front door to speak of, just a heavy curtain hanging over the entrance to keep out the worst of the wind. Inside, the space is barely big enough for a family of 5 or 6, depending on how many children survive the winter. Welcome to medieval housing, where personal space is a luxury reserved for nobles who have entire castles to themselves, while the rest of us pile into one room, shacks like sardines in a barrel. The floor beneath your feet is packed dirt, trampled down by years of footsteps, and the occasional livestock that wandered inside during a storm. There's no insulation, so in the winter, the cold seeps through the walls like a ghost, and in the summer, the heat turns the tiny space into an oven filled with sweat and misery. A single window, just a hole in the wall covered by an oiled cloth, lets in some light, but does absolutely nothing to improve the airflow. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually preferred living in such cramped conditions or if they simply had no other choice. Some records suggest that people were used to close quarters, having grown up surrounded by siblings, parents, and sometimes even animals, all sharing the same space. Others believe that overcrowding contributed heavily to the spread of disease, especially when multiple generations lived together under one roof without proper sanitation. Quirky medieval housing fact: some families kept pigs indoors during the winter to use their body heat as a natural source of warmth. Yes, really? So picture this. You're trying to sleep on a straw mattress while a full-grown pig snores next to you. Its warm breath hitting your face as it rolls over and accidentally crushes your foot. Charming furniture is minimal at best. There's a wooden table, probably handmade and wobbly, a few stools carved from tree stumps, and maybe a chest to store whatever few possessions you own. No closets, no drawers, no shelves. Just whatever space you can find to stash your clothes, tools, and food before rats get to them first. Your bed, more like a communal nest. A straw-stuffed mattress sits in one corner, shared by everyone in the household, parents, children, grandparents, all piled together like cordwood wrapped in rough wool blankets that haven't been washed since the last plague outbreak. If you're lucky, there's a thin sheet between you and the person next to you, but more often than not, you're pressed against sweaty skin and tangled limbs all night long. And let's talk about privacy, or rather the complete lack of it. There are no separate rooms, no doors to shut, no curtains to pull around your sleeping area. Everything happens in the open berth: deaths, arguments, sex. If someone wants to know what you're doing, they just have to look across the room, want to take a piss. Better hope nobody's watching, because the chamber pot is right there in the corner. And if you don't make it in time, well, congrats on the new rug. Disease thrives in these conditions, with no ventilation, no cleaning supplies, and no way to properly dispose of waste germs spread like wildfire. Lice, fleas, and bed bugs infest every crack and crevice, crawling over bodies and bedding alike. Respiratory illnesses run rampant in the winter months when smoke from the hearth fills the air and everyone coughs themselves to sleep. And if someone gets sick, good luck keeping the infection contained. There's no quarantine, no isolation, just waiting for the sickness to move on to the next victim. Quirky medieval illness fact: some cultures believed that sneezing was a sign of impending death. Because why not? In a world where everything could kill you, a sudden expulsion of air from your nose probably seemed like a solid indicator that your time was up. But hey, at least you got fire. The hearth sits in the center of the room, providing both warmth and a place to cook. Smoke rises toward the ceiling, escaping through a small hole in the roof, or at least it should escape. Sometimes the chimney doesn't work properly, and the whole house fills with choking fumes until someone finally remembers to poke a stick through the vent to clear it out. Food storage is another nightmare. Without refrigeration, everything has to be dried, salted, or pickled to last more than a day. Meat hangs from hooks near the fire, slowly curing in the heat while flies buzz around it. Grains sit in woven baskets constantly threatened by mice and weevils. Milk spoils within hours. Unless it's turned into cheese, and fresh vegetables are only available during certain seasons. So, as you sit there scratching at your flea bites and trying not to inhale too deeply, you realize something. This isn't just a house. It's a breeding ground for filth, disease, and despair. Every surface, every object, every breath you take is tainted by the sheer impossibility of staying clean in a world built for suffering. And yet somehow, people survive. They raise families, build homes, pass down traditions, and endure year after miserable year. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about paying rent. That's already been taken care of in the form of labor taxes and the ever-present threat of starvation. If you fail to meet your obligations, the sun dips below the horizon, and with it, the last traces of warmth vanish from your world. The air turns sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke as darkness creeps in like an enemy you can't fight. You glance toward the tiny window, just a hole covered by oiled cloth, and watch as the last sliver of daylight disappears. And just like that, the night begins. Welcome to medieval nights, where the absence of light isn't just inconvenient. It's dangerous, terrifying, and filled with things that might actually kill you. Because here's the thing, without electricity, without street lamps, without even decent candles for most people, the world after sunset is a void, a black abyss where every sound is magnified, every shadow moves on its own, and every whisper could be the wind or something worse. You sit near the hearth watching the fire flicker against the stone walls of your home. It's the only source of light you've got, casting long, dancing shadows that make the room feel alive. Outside, the village grows quiet, but not peaceful. No, this silence is heavy, unnatural. The usual sounds of livestock, children playing, and distant hammering from the blacksmith have vanished. All that remains are the occasional howl of a stray dog, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant hoot of an owl, one of the many creatures believed to be messengers of the devil. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely feared the dark more than modern humans, or if their superstitions simply made it seem that way. Some records suggest that curfews were strictly enforced in many towns, with citizens expected to be indoors before sundown. Others indicate that nighttime was associated with witchcraft, demons, and all manner of supernatural threats, making people reluctant to leave their homes after dark, unless absolutely necessary. Quirky medieval superstition fact. Some cultures believed that if you heard footsteps behind you at night, you shouldn't turn around. You might see your own ghost following you. Instead, they advised walking backward until you reached safety, which seems like a terrible idea if you're trying not to trip over a root, or fall into a ditch. So, what do people actually do when the sun goes down? Not much, honestly. Most families gather around the fire, using the remaining embers to cook whatever food they manage to scrounge up earlier in the day. Meals are simple bread, cheese, maybe some stew if they're lucky. There's no Netflix to binge watch, no books to read by candlelight, because literacy is rare and paper is expensive. So conversations revolve around gossip, religious stories, and, of course, terrifying tales meant to keep children from wandering outside. Children, by the way, don't sleep alone. They never do. Entire families pile onto the same straw mattress wrapped in wool blankets that smell like sweat smoke and mildew. Privacy doesn't exist. If someone has to relieve themselves in the middle of the night, they grab the chamber pot and hope nobody else wakes up to witness it. If someone starts coughing, the whole house hears it. And if someone dies during the night, well, the body stays right there until morning comes. Moving it in the dark would be too risky. What if the dead person wasn't really dead? What if they just looked dead? Better safe than sorry. But let's talk about bedtime rituals, or rather, the complete lack of them. There's no toothbrushing, no skincare routine, no pajamas beyond whatever clothes you wore during the day. Most people go to bed fully dressed because undressing means exposing your skin to the ever-present threat of lice, fleas, and bed bugs. And heaven help you if you try to wash your face before sleeping. Water is scarce, and washing anything other than your hands is considered unnecessary at best and suspicious at worst. After all, cleanliness is next to godliness. But apparently, medieval godliness involves smelling like sweat and old bread. Sleep itself is another challenge. With no pillows, no mattresses worth speaking of, and a constant battle against pests, rest is elusive. People toss and turn on thin layers of straw, waking up with sore muscles and bites they didn't notice until morning. And if you manage to fall asleep, dreams are often haunted by visions of demons, witches, and otherworldly horrors, because why wouldn't they be? Your entire life is spent surrounded by disease, death, and uncertainty. Of course, your subconscious is going to torment you while you sleep. Quirky medieval dream theory. Some scholars believe that nightmares were caused by incubi and succubi, demonic beings who visited sleeping victims and either tormented them or engaged in sexual acts with them. So if you woke up feeling drained, sweaty, and terrified, it probably meant you'd been attacked by a demon overnight. Great, just what you needed. And then there's the matter of security. Without locks on doors, without guards patrolling the streets, and without any real law enforcement at night, villages become vulnerable. Thieves prowl in the darkness, slipping through open windows or picking apart wooden shutters to steal whatever valuables a family might possess. Bandits lurk on the roads waiting for travelers to pass by so they can rob them, or worse. And if you live near the forest, well, let's just say there are plenty of rumors about what happens to people who wander too far after sundown. Some towns have watchmen, volunteers, or hired guards who walk the streets with torches, calling out the time and keeping an eye out for trouble. But these patrols are inconsistent at best, and many watchmen spend more time drinking than actually watching. If something happens, say a house catches fire or someone screams in the night, there's no emergency service to call, no police, no firefighters, just neighbors rushing in with buckets of water or weapons in hand, hoping they arrive in time. So as you lie there staring at the ceiling while rats scratch behind the walls and your neighbor snores loudly enough to wake the dead, you realize something. The night isn't just dark, it's endless. Every hour stretches forever, filled with fear, discomfort, and the knowledge that dawn is still hours away. And yet somehow, people survive. They endure the cold, the hunger, the terror, and the exhaustion, knowing that tomorrow will bring more of the same. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about insomnia. In a world where survival is exhausting, sleep comes easily, even if it's filled with nightmares. You wake up to the sound of screaming, not just one person. No, this is a full-blown chorus of terror echoing through the village like a war cry from hell itself. You stumble out of your hut, still groggy from last night's restless sleep, and immediately wish you hadn't. The sky is dark with smoke. The air smells like burning wood, scorched flesh, and something else, something foul, something wrong. Somewhere nearby a house is on fire, flames licking at the thatched roof as panicked villagers scramble to put it out with buckets of water that won't be nearly enough. Someone trips and falls in the mud, their scream cut short as a flaming beam crashes down behind them. A child wails for their mother, lost in the chaos. Welcome to disaster season in the Middle Ages, where plague, fire, and pure chaos are just another Tuesday. Because, here's the thing, life was already miserable, but sometimes Mother Nature decides that misery isn't quite bad enough and adds an extra layer of horror just to keep things interesting. And today is one of those days. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually believed these disasters were divine punishment, or if they just accepted them as part of life. Some records suggest that plagues were seen as God's wrath unleashed upon sinners, while others indicate that fires were blamed on witchcraft or demonic interference. Either way, nobody had any real understanding of what was happening, which meant everyone was just trying not to die while praying to saints who probably weren't listening. Quirky medieval disaster fact. Some cultures believed that carrying a piece of St. Agatha's veil would protect you from lightning strikes. Others thought that wearing garlic around your neck would ward off evil spirits during thunderstorms. Spoiler, neither worked. But let's start with the big one, the plague. Because yes, that's exactly what this is. The Black Death has arrived in your village, and it brought friends. It starts subtly. One person gets sick, fever is shaken, coughing up blood. Then another. Then 10 more. Within days, the entire town is infected. Bodies piling up faster than they can be buried. The streets reek of rotting flesh, the stench so strong it clings to your clothes no matter how many times you scrub them. Children run around playing with dead rats, completely unaware that those little furry corpses are the very reason their parents are dying. There's no cure, no antibiotics, no vaccines, no quarantine measures beyond locking the sick inside their homes and hoping they don't spread it further. Doctors wear ridiculous bird masks filled with herbs, convinced that bad air is the cause when in reality it's fleas. Tiny, disgusting fleas crawling all over everything, jumping from rat to human, injecting poison into your bloodstream without warning. And once the plague takes hold, there's no escaping it. Your lymph nodes swell into grotesque lumps the size of apples. Your skin turns black as bruises spread across your body, and your lungs fill with fluid until every breath feels like drowning. Some people go mad before they die screaming about demons and visions of hell. Others simply collapse in the middle of the street left there until someone drags them away. If you're lucky enough to survive, you'll carry the scars forever. Physical reminders of the pain you endured, along with the emotional weight of knowing that half your family is gone. If you're unlucky, well, congratulations, you're next. But hey, at least the plague isn't the only thing trying to kill you. Because right now that fire is spreading. Fast wooden houses, dry thatch roofs, and tightly packed villages make for the perfect recipe for disaster. One spark is all it takes. One candle knocked over by a clumsy hand. One ember carried by the wind. One careless cook forgetting to put out the fire before bed. And just like that, everything is engulfed. People run in every direction, some carrying children, others grabbing whatever belongings they can salvage before the flames consume them. Horses bolt, pigs squeal, dogs bark wildly as the heat intensifies, turning the village into a battlefield of panic and destruction. Water buckets pass from hand to hand, but it's useless against the inferno. By the time the fire burns itself out, half the town will be reduced to ash. And if you somehow manage to survive both the plague and the fire, great. Now you get to deal with famine, because, let's face it, at this point, nothing is going your way. Crops have been ruined by disease, livestock has either died or fled, and the roads leading into town are clogged with refugees fleeing their own disasters. Food becomes scarce, then non-existent. People starve to death in the streets, their stomachs bloated from hunger, their eyes sunken and glassy. Desperation sets in, rumors spread about cannibalism. People trade anything they have left for a handful of grain, even their children. Historians still argue whether medieval famines ever truly reached the level of outright cannibalism, or if those stories were exaggerated. But records do show that during severe food shortages, people resorted to eating anything they could find, including rats, tree bark, and even dirt. In extreme cases, infanticide became common with starving families, abandoning newborns or killing weak children to conserve resources. Quirky medieval famine fact. Some towns held corpse feasts, where people gathered to eat meals made from the bodies of the recently deceased. Others turned to religious rituals, offering sacrifices to gods in hopes of ending the drought. Neither method worked. And if you somehow survive that, well, guess what? War is coming. Yes, because apparently the universe has decided that you haven't suffered enough yet. Soldiers march through the countryside, pillaging villages, burning farms, and leaving nothing but death in their wake. Whether it's a local noble fighting over land, a king expanding his territory, or mercenaries hired to loot and destroy, the result is always the same: more suffering. You try to hide, but hiding doesn't work. Soldiers kick down doors, drag people from their homes, and execute anyone who resists. Women are raped. Men are killed. Children are taken as slaves or forced into military service. If you're lucky, you're only robbed. If you're not, well, enjoy being impaled on a spike while your neighbors watch helplessly. Quirky medieval warfare fact. Some armies use catapults to launch diseased corpses over enemy walls, essentially inventing biological warfare centuries before modern science caught up. So, yeah, medieval warfare wasn't just brutal, it was actively trying to kill everyone. So as you stand there watching your home burn, your neighbors die, and your world crumble around you, you realize something. This isn't just bad luck, this is the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, survival isn't about skill, intelligence, or strength. It's about sheer, unrelenting endurance. Because no matter what happens, whether it's plague, fire, famine, or war, somehow, people keep going. They rebuild, they recover, they endure year after miserable year, knowing that tomorrow might bring another disaster, but also knowing that they've survived worse. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real miracle of the Middle Ages. You wake up to the same four walls, the same straw mattress, the same damp air thick with the scent of sweat and mildew. The sun rises like it always does, casting pale light through the tiny window, but nothing about this day feels different from the last. Because here's the truth: nothing ever changes. Welcome to life as a peasant in the Middle Ages, a never-ending cycle of labor, suffering, and unrelenting poverty that traps you in place like an iron cage with no key. You were born into this misery, and unless something miraculous happens, you'll die in it too. There is no escape, no social mobility, no way to rise above your station unless fate decides to intervene with a miracle or tragedy, usually both. If you're lucky, you might inherit your father's land, scraping out a living on the same patch of dirt he worked before you. If you're unlucky, you'll be forced to rent space on someone else's property, paying exorbitant fees just for the privilege of farming ground that isn't yours. Either way, you're bound to the soil, tied to the whims of nobles who see you as little more than livestock with a work ethic. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually had any hope of improving their lives, or if they simply accepted their lot as divine punishment for original sin. Some records suggest that occasional individuals managed to climb the social ladder. Merchants who grew wealthy enough to buy land, soldiers who earned favor with nobility, or monks who rose through the ranks of the church. But these cases were rare exceptions, not the rule. For most people, life was spent in the same village doing the same back-breaking work, dying at the same age, and leaving behind children who would follow the exact same path. Quirky medieval class fact: some cultures believed that the poor were spiritually superior to the rich because they endured hardship without complaint. Others claimed that poverty was a sign of divine favor, proving that God trusted them to suffer without rebelling. Either way, nobody seemed particularly interested in fixing the system. So, what exactly keeps you trapped? Let's start with the feudal hierarchy, the invisible chains binding every aspect of your existence. At the very top sits the king, followed by lords, knights, and clergy, all of whom live off the labor of those beneath them. Below them are the peasants, divided into serfs, villeins, and cottagers, each with varying degrees of freedom, but none with real power. Serfs are essentially tied to the land, unable to leave their lord's estate without permission. Villeins have slightly more autonomy, but still owe heavy taxes and labor obligations. Cottagers, the poorest of the poor, own so little that they must rent even the smallest plots of land just to survive. And let's talk about those taxes. There's the tithe, which demands 10% of your harvest go directly to the church. There's the tallage, a tax imposed by your local lord whenever he feels like squeezing extra money out of his tenants. There's the corvée, which forces you to work on your lord's fields instead of your own without pay. And then there's the marriage tax, inheritance tax, and even death tax, all designed to ensure that no matter how hard you work, you'll never truly own anything. If you somehow manage to scrape together enough coins to buy your freedom, congratulations. Now you can become a freeman. But good luck finding work that doesn't involve servitude. Most jobs require apprenticeships that last years, controlled by guilds that charge ridiculous fees just to train under a master craftsman. Even if you do find a trade, wages are barely enough to keep food on the table, and unemployment means starvation. But hey, at least you don't have to worry about getting arrested for vagrancy, because yes, that's a thing. If you're caught wandering without a job or a noble sponsor, you can be thrown in jail or worse, sold into indentured servitude. The concept of freedom exists mostly in theory and practice. Everyone owes someone something, and escaping that debt is nearly impossible. Quirky medieval law? Fact. Some towns had beggar licenses where homeless individuals could legally ask for alms if they carried official documents proving their poverty. Others implemented harsh anti-vagrancy laws, punishing unemployed travelers with whippings, branding, or execution, because apparently being poor was considered a crime. So what happens if you try to run away? Maybe you pack up your few belongings, kiss your family goodbye, and head toward the nearest city in hopes of starting fresh. Big mistake. Without papers proving your status, you're immediately suspected of being a runaway serf, which means you could be captured, beaten, or returned to your former master like a piece of lost property. Cities aren't much safer, filled with corrupt officials who demand bribes just to let you enter. And if you don't have money, well, enjoy sleeping in the streets while rats nibble at your feet. Even if you make it past the guards, life in the city isn't exactly glamorous. Sure, there's more opportunity, but also more competition. Jobs are scarce, housing is cramped, and sanitation is non-existent. Disease spreads faster in crowded urban areas, turning entire neighborhoods into graveyards overnight. Crime thrives in the shadows, with thieves preying on the desperate and gangs controlling the black market. And if you can't afford rent, congrats, you're officially homeless. Historians still argue whether medieval cities offered true opportunities for social mobility or if they were just another trap disguised as freedom. Some records suggest that urban centers allowed for greater economic independence, especially among merchants and artisans. Others indicate that the gap between rich and poor was just as wide in cities as it was in rural areas, with the lower classes struggling just as hard to survive. So as you sit there scratching at your flea bites and staring at the same ceiling you've seen every morning since birth, you realize something. This isn't just a life. It's a prison, a system built to keep people like you in one place, grinding away until your body gives out and your children take over where you left off. And yet, despite everything, despite the endless labor, the crushing debt, the lack of rights, you keep going. You plant your seeds, you tend your animals, you raise your kids, and you pray that maybe, just maybe, their lives will be better than yours. Because that's all you can do. You wake up one morning and realize something strange. You're still alive. That in itself is a miracle. You've survived the toothaches, the hunger, the filth, the parasites, the disease, the superstitions, the labor, the injustice, the disasters, and every other miserable hardship this world has thrown at you. And yet here you are, still breathing, still moving, still somehow clinging to life like a barnacle on the side of a ship. Because surviving in the Middle Ages isn't about luck, it's about endurance. It's about waking up every day knowing that today could be your last, but getting out of bed anyway. It's about dragging yourself through the mud, the blood, the sweat, and the tears, knowing that death is always waiting just around the corner, but refusing to meet it yet. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually believed they had any control over their own fate, or if they simply accepted suffering as part of existence. Some records suggest that faith played a major role in keeping people going, offering them hope that their struggles would be rewarded in the afterlife. Others indicate that sheer stubbornness was the key people refused to give up, not because they expected things to get better, but because giving up meant losing everything quirky medieval survival fact. Some cultures believed that holding onto a piece of St. Christopher's relic would protect travelers from sudden death. Others thought that wearing a charm made from a dead person's fingernails would ward off evil spirits. Spoiler, neither worked. But hey, people tried. So how did anyone survive at all? How did entire generations make it through plagues, famines, wars, and natural disasters without completely collapsing under the weight of despair? The answer lies in resilience, the quiet, unshakable determination to keep going, even when everything around you screams for you to stop. People adapted. They learned to live with pain, with loss, with uncertainty. They built homes from whatever materials they could find, patched their clothes until there was nothing left to patch, and found ways to feed themselves even when food was scarce. They formed communities, relying on each other for support, sharing resources, protecting one another when danger came knocking. And most importantly, they held on to hope, even if that hope was small, even if it was unrealistic, even if it was based on nothing more than the belief that tomorrow might be slightly better than today. Because in a world where survival was never guaranteed, even the smallest victories mattered. A warm meal, a clean shirt, a night without rats chewing on your toes, a child who lived past their first winter. These were the things people clung to, the tiny sparks of joy that kept them from falling apart completely. But survival came at a cost. Every generation bore the scars of what they endured, physical wounds, emotional trauma, the lingering grief of lost loved ones. People aged quickly, their bodies worn down by years of hard labor, poor nutrition, and constant exposure to disease. By the time they reached 40, many looked decades older, their skin lined with exhaustion, their eyes dulled by years of hardship. And yet, despite everything, life continued. Children were born, crops were planted, fires were rebuilt. Wars ended only to be replaced by new conflicts. The cycle repeated itself over and over, generation after generation, until slowly, imperceptibly, the world began to change. The Middle Ages weren't just a time of misery. They were a time of endurance, of perseverance, of human willpower tested to its absolute limits. People didn't just survive, they endured. They fought against nature, against disease, against oppression, against every force that sought to break them, and somehow, impossibly, they kept going. So as you sit there watching the sun rise once again over the same village you've always known, you realize something. You may not have escaped the hardships of this life, but you've made it this far, and that in itself is an achievement worth remembering. Now close your eyes. Let the soft hum of the morning birds lull you into peace and drift into the gentle embrace of sleep. You exhale slowly, feeling the weight of centuries lift from your shoulders. The world around you fades into a warm golden haze. Smoke curling lazily from chimneys. The soft clatter of wooden buckets against stone wells. The distant laughter of children playing barefoot in the dirt. It's not peaceful. Not really, but it's familiar, and somehow that's enough. The flickering firelight dances across the walls of your tiny home, casting long shadows that stretch like ghosts through time. Outside, the wind whispers through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, the same scent that has lingered for generations. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once, then settles back into silence. The night is deep, now slow-moving, heavy with exhaustion. You pull the rough wool blanket tighter around your shoulders, letting the warmth seep into your bones. Your body aches from labor, from age, from years of living in a world that never made things easy. But there's comfort in this ache, in the knowledge that you've made it through another day, another year, another lifetime of struggle. You close your eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of your own breath, matching it to the quiet hum of the world outside. And as sleep begins to take you, as your thoughts drift toward dreams of fields untouched by famine, of clean water running freely from wooden taps of a world where disease can be cured with something as simple as a pill, you smile just a little. Because even if you never got to see that world, even if you lived and suffered and endured in a time when survival was the only victory worth having, you were here, you existed, you fought, you survived. So let go now. Let the past fade into memory. Let the present slip into stillness, and let the future unfold without you. Rest well, traveler. You've earned it.